So whether or not America was there, given the way that we fought in New Guinea, I would like to think that that would make an invasion very difficult to do. And so we forced the Japanese back, and eventually what happens is then we start pushing them left, right, and center. And that's where the Americans become far more useful than us. So we wrestle back control of New Guinea, and the issue is like, because of conscription, we've got conscript forces in Australia and New Guinea, but to the west is Dutch New Guinea. And so as soon as you go over that border, theoretically under the old rules, conscript forces couldn't fight there. So 1943, that's when Curtin changes his kind of conscript rules to allow conscription in the South Pacific. And so we push them back. And again, they're getting pushed back left, right, and center. The Americans are using a strategy called island hopping, which is basically bypassing unnecessary islands to get to Japan quicker.
We're going to go to Mykonos, and then we're going to go to Crete, and then we're going to go to... It's not what I think of when I think of island hopping.
The Isle of Man. Shout out to, we've got one listener from the Isle of Man that did show up on the stats. So
nice.
Shout out to, it was this independent country. I loved it.
I remember all I know of the Isle of Man was on Top Gear when they're like, there's no speed limits in the Isle of Man. And I'm like, what?
Yeah, and it's like no tax either. It's an incredible tax haven.
What?
Yeah. Speaking of tax, where do we pay our taxes to?
The ATO.
The Australian Taxation Office.
Yes, kind of put our Cayman Island subsidiary accounts and our like Virgin Island trusts aside. That's where we theoretically would be paying tax to. That was a Curtin reform. So if we go back to the beginning of Federation, it was the states who did tax. That was an absolute deal breaker for Federation. Was we want to retain as much independence as we can. We want to federate for national defence, but really we want to have independent control of our taxes. So the state government had control of taxes. World War I comes around and we introduced federal tax because we needed to kind of collectively control resources. And we needed to make sure that everyone was pulling their weight in terms of getting money for the war, which left a situation where you had state and income tax. That's pretty messy. So you got to pay, like it's Ben Shapiro's nightmare, right? You got to pay state tax and federal tax.
Which is what they still have in America, isn't they? They're all got very bizarre state tax.
I think that's right, yeah.
Like it really like in terms, I remember seeing it about like NBA players and like the discrepancies in how much tax they pay just based on what team they pay for. Like you want to go play in like in Dallas and stuff because there's just like tax rules are so different to playing in California. It's like, it's mental.
So that's why Dirk Nowitzki was a maverick.
Yeah, maybe.
So yeah, basically it's a messy system, and so Curtin decides in World War II, he's like, sorry states, it's been 40 years now. The Australian identity is pretty strong. We're in a war. You cannot be claiming income tax. We'll deal with tax and we'll give you money. Now, obviously, the state can still make a ton of money through things like licensing and like they've got their own money-making revenue streams, of course, but he takes over income tax. And that's actually a huge reform that is made during the course of the war. Throughout the end of the war, what happens is the Allies, they island hop throughout the kind of Southwest Pacific. So they don't even really bother trying to liberate the Dutch East Indies. The Dutch East Indies had huge oil and rubber supplies. Like if we can just put a naval blockade on that, the Japanese can't get oil and rubber from the Dutch East Indies. Don't worry about invading, just put a naval blockade. Focus our attention on other islands. So you've got MacArthur coming from the south. You've got Chester Nimitz, the guy that I mentioned before. I prefer him so much more to MacArthur. He comes from the east, and so they take over islands like the Marianas and like kind of move closer by taking things like Saipan and that sort of thing. And they get into pretty close proximity to Japan, and they can start firebombing and strategic bombing. MacArthur comes from the south, and he takes over the Philippines. Basically, this is how much of a jerk he is. So he delivered an address to the Filipino people, and his address said, "I have returned."
Oh,
referencing.
It's like the Michael Jordan returning to basketball kind of thing. I'm back.
The interesting thing was his advisors said, "Hey, maybe it's kind of a team effort here. Maybe you can change it to we." And he was like, "No."
Wow.
There's an iconic photo of like MacArthur. So the boats disembark and he gets off the boat and he walks in the water with this like real strut with his aviators on. It's a really iconic photo. The context you need to know about that photo, if you have seen it, is that it was taken, I think maybe about like 4 or 5 hours after they landed in the Philippines. So they just did a reenactment for propaganda purposes. And so eventually America takes control of the Philippines, and with Nimitz taking the kind of islands that were more towards the east, and with MacArthur advancing from the south, they're in a position where they can start bombing Japan. So firstly, they do strategic bombing, which was getting rid of Japanese factories. So you bomb Japanese factories to crush their industrial capacity. Then you have firebombing, which was particularly effective because Japanese houses are made of wood. So you just kind of drop some fire and watch these Japanese cities burn up. The theory behind it was that would get Japan to surrender because it would put too much pressure on them. You could argue that it's just a war crime.
Oh, yeah, big time.
Not you could argue, it is. And so they're trying to pressure the Japanese people to surrender. They won't. The Japanese government's got them ready to go. So the Japanese soldiers, for an invasion, they were prepared they had to sharpen bamboo sticks ready to attack any American that came on site. They would not surrender under any circumstances. In Saipan, Japanese civilians were told, rather than surrender to the Americans, jump to your death off a cliff, and they did.
Jeez.
So, again, that isn't even mainland. That isn't the 4 main islands of Japan. That's more distant Japanese territory, and they're still radicalized enough to do it.
Wasn't there like a story of a Japanese soldier found years after the war?
In the 1970s. And he just didn't believe anyone. We were like, yeah, the war's over. It reminds me of that Family Guy.
No, you're lying. We would never surrender.
Yeah.
Insane.
That Family Guy joke where Bush is ready to fight. He's in Vietnam. It's like, sir, the war is over. Oh, man.
Yeah.
But yeah, they're they're so radicalized that as late as the 1970s, they don't believe anyone when they're saying, no. Here's Hirohito, your emperor, like pleading for a surrender. And yeah, they're like, well, no, he wouldn't do that. And so, yeah, they're incredibly radicalized. And the context for the bomb is when we drop the atomic bomb, it's easy to take one of two extremes. Like, yes, it's a war crime by killing innocent civilians. But the kind of right-wing argument is also kind of true in that, like, it did spare potentially more casualties because we forget just how prepared for an invasion Japan was. And Japan was not willing to surrender under any circumstances, and that an invasion actually might have ended up killing both, certainly more Americans, but a whole lot more Japanese as well. And so, like, that is certainly a valid point because Japan was ready pretty much under any circumstances. John Curtin, 1944. He has a heart attack.
Oh, no.
He survives.
Hooray.
So John Curtin, he survives his heart attack in 1944, but it's clear that his health is deteriorating really badly. Having seen MacArthur's antics, he gets pretty nervous about being so pro-America. He's like, have we just traded one guy who doesn't respect us for another guy who doesn't respect us? And so what he does is with New Zealand, they actually signed something called the Anzac Agreement, which was them trying to negotiate a kind of deal where they limited US influence to north of the equator. And that's a little detail that's forgotten about at the end of the war. We're often like, okay, Curtin pivoted towards America and we've been pro-America ever since. Actually, Curtin got a little bit suspicious. And he started to his conversations with Churchill got a lot better by the end of the war. And that was when he was realizing that he was starting to get screwed over a little bit by America. 6 weeks before the end of the war, Curtin has another heart attack. And he dies.
Oh, wow. So he didn't even get to enter the promised land, you know.
No.
He didn't get to see the end of it.
Yeah. So he doesn't live to see the Japanese surrender. He dies at age 60, I'm pretty sure. Mm-hmm. The kind of effect of an intensely stressful war, probably combined with his earlier years being heavily under the bottle, played a role as well. And one thing we need to kind of...
No conspiracy.
Okay.
Yes. I mean, not like the Joseph Lyons one. One thing we need to remember with John Curtin is when we're talking about his alcoholism, it was something he overcame. So 35 onwards, he's much, much less under the influence of alcohol. It does still have an effect on him later down the years, but it was something that he did overcome. And at the same time, it was like he overcame it just in time to be the leader that Australia needed during World War II. It's a true. I reckon it's a, like, again, I get that we don't want to create a cult of personality around anyone, but it's unbelievable that we don't know who he is. Like most Australian students have no idea who John Curtin is. It's not taught. It's not really taught in history. But like that is an incredibly kind of powerful story. Whether you kind of sit left or right on the kind of the political spectrum or whatever, a lot of the wartime stuff isn't a matter of left or right. It actually does a lot of right wing things like introduce conscription. It's a really incredible story of kind of the triumph of Australian leadership in that situation. So we'll come on to Ben Chifley next week and see kind of what happens after the war. A guy called Frank Ford takes control for a very brief period until they kind of put in Ben Chifley as the main man. In terms of a final thing for how America treated us, our wartime effort, we kind of evaluated it at 28%. So we made 28% contribution to the fall of Japan and beating Japan. America gave us 8%. So we were responsible for 8% of Japan's defeat.
I'd love to know the calculation of these.